Hello there. You're very welcome to the residence of the British Ambassador in Dublin. My name is Hugh Linehan. I'm the Arts and Culture Editor of the Irish Times, and I'm delighted to be invited here today by the Ambassador, Paul Johnston. Ambassador, hello.
Hi, Hugh.
We're here to talk as part of the St. Patrick's Festival and I.NY about cultural links between the United Kingdom and Ireland, and particular work which you're interested in pursuing since you arrived here, I think about a year and a half ago now.
Yes, that's right. And I was conscious in both applying for this job and coming here how almost uniquely close the relationship is between people across the two islands. And I think culture is a really important part of that. In all the overseas postings I've done, and indeed living in London and Glasgow and close to Edinburgh, culture has always been a big part of my private life, my personal life. But in my postings as ambassador as well, I've wanted to make it a big part of my professional life because I think culture is a really important part, whether it's arts, literature, music, of how you bring people together. And so one of the great sadnesses of my first 18 months here has been that COVID has meant so much of the live arts and cultural scene has been closed for all of us. So looking ahead now, it's one of the projects we have as an embassy, trying to build those cultural connections between Britain and Ireland.
I suppose one of the things about Britain and Ireland is our histories and our cultures are so closely intertwined that perhaps we take them for granted too much and we don't explore them or examine them and develop them as much as we should.
I think that's true. I think, many British people would probably not know that Oscar Wilde and George Bernard Shaw were Irish, and a lot of Irish people probably will not know some aspects of British culture. And I think we do sort of overlook maybe aspects of our more established culture. And I think there's always more that could be done to sort of unearth and discover and promote new culture, new talent. And I think also one of the things that we're doing as an embassy is about trying to build the relationship between Britain and Ireland beyond the capitals, so beyond London and Dublin. And that's both in the sort of economic, science, educational fields. But I think culture is an important part of that as well. So just 10 days ago, I was down in Cork, helping to cement a new partnership between the Glucksman Arts Gallery at UCC and the Herbert Art Gallery in Cork. The two cities have been twinned for over 60 years. And now they're taking forward these two rather dynamic modern art galleries, taking forward a new creative partnership. So if the embassy can sort of lend its hand to and help that sort of activity, that's something that I think is good for the wider relationship between the two countries.
Those kinds of relationships, I think, are particularly interesting because we're sitting here in Dublin, obviously, and very often the British-Irish relationship at an official level, I suppose, is characterised as a relationship between the two capitals. But of course, there are all kinds of connections between different parts of Ireland and different parts of the United Kingdom.
Exactly. So without this being too much of a traveller's tales, a week or two ago, I was also in Galway because Galway has had this great experience, a difficult experience a couple of years ago, of being European City of Culture, with COVID coming on just a couple of months into its cultural year. And it has very strong links with the Leeds Bradford area of England, partly because they have quite big film and digital tech sectors, and partly because both of those have upcoming years of culture in the next couple of years. So again, we were taking forward a partnership in which Galway was sharing its lessons and Leeds and Bradford were sort of busy imbibing that. And I know from my own time as a student in Glasgow in the late 1980s, how much Glasgow being the European City of Culture in 1990 was a sort of transformational moment for the city in terms of investment and recognition, and it gave the whole area a lift. So I think as we emerge from COVID and as we emerge from some of the complications of Brexit and its aftermath, and now as we emerge into this terrible period for European security, I think looking at culture both as something that sort of uplifts people, takes them out of the sort of the tensions and the troubles of their everyday lives, but also something that has a really important economic as well as socio-economic impact. I think that's something that government can play a role in supporting, and the British Council here in Ireland as well. And it's great fun, I think, and inspiring to meet young artistic entrepreneurs and and help them on their way a little bit.
Could you talk a little bit more about, I mean, the Galway Leeds Bradford relationship seems to be very interesting in a number of ways. As you say, there's been investment in both those urban centres by the respective governments, particularly in the areas of digital technology, filmmaking, and that sort of thing. But equally, Leeds Bradford presumably forms part of the focus, the current levelling up focus in the United Kingdom too.
Exactly.
So there are similarities there too.
And it's a big part of the government's agenda to look at spreading wealth and spreading opportunity beyond London and the southeast, across the whole of England, Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland. Part of that is about public investment, but also about private investment. And in the way the arts and the culture, media industry are at that intersection of public and private investment. And I think part of the sort of the recognition that the north of England, I always think of that sort of, yes, Prime Minister episode in which there's a plan to relocate part of, the Ministry of Defence or the Armed Forces away from the south of England towards the north of England. And Sir Humphrey and the generals basically imply that civilization stops somewhere around the North Circular, and there'd be no sort of, no decent shops or theatre or any form of entertainment. The Watford Gap, exactly. And I think if you think of the fantastic opera and theatre and orchestras and culture of all sorts that you get across the United Kingdom, that's both important in itself and something to be treasured. But I also think when I, as ambassador in Sweden, for example, was talking to potential foreign investors, when they were thinking about setting up a business in different parts of the UK, they'd be looking not just at the obvious things like transport links and schooling, but things like a vivid and vibrant local cultural life, galleries, green spaces, that sort of cultural infrastructure mattered just as much as the sort of the harder physical infrastructure. So I think part of the government's levelling up agenda is not just the creation of jobs and the creation of transport hubs across the country. It's also these cultural bloomings in different parts, which are obviously to do with individuals and their creativity and their imagination. You can't create culture by government diktat, but you can create the sort of the foundations or the context where young people can, and not so young people, can thrive and help create great culture.
Which is what that idea of soft power is about, isn't it? And
exactly.
I think particularly as we speak, the notion of soft power sounds particularly attractive given the alternatives that we see in other parts of Europe at the moment.
Indeed, and I think I think culture at its best is of course it's an expression of a free society, and it flourishes best in a free society. And if you think of the impact that things like not just the BBC World Service, but plays and music and drama has had, in your own case, what the cultural awakening in Ireland around the turn of the last century meant for the sort of the growth of the Irish sort of national movement. And I know from my time in the sort of Nordic and Baltic states that sort of music festivals were a big part of the Baltic states sort of reawakening as they sought to escape from the Soviet Union. I always think of that marvellous, Prisoners' Chorus and Fidelio as they emerged from out of the dark, blinking into the free air. So I think the power of music and art and literature to inspire people is significant. And I think for every country, the Irish do it, I think, marvellously, not just on St. Patrick's Day, but around the year. The notion of a country's soft power and the power of its diaspora, I think, is tremendously important. And I think in this age of global communications, there's still a really important space for the promotion of one's national culture, not in a sort of hard, cynical, government-driven way, but in a way that just sort of creates the opportunity for stuff to bloom and prosper, including stuff that would be critical of the government of the day. I think that's part of a vibrant cultural scene, and that's why free democracies will always ultimately triumph, because they have that strength of free expression behind them, which no autocrat can ever hold back ultimately.
We're not going to revisit Brexit, but just at this point, just in relation to that, to ask you, is part of this project which you've undertaken, to some extent at least, a process of redress for what has been quite a fraught period for the relationship between the two countries?
I think there's two different things there. There's no denying that the past few years have been difficult for the relationship. It's a very intense and close relationship politically. Only last weekend I was in London for the first meeting for a couple of years of the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly, and there was fraught discussions on things like the Northern Ireland Protocol, the legacy issue, what's going to happen next in Northern Ireland. In a way, the dreadful events in Ukraine did, I think, require us all to step back and think about all the underlying values and interests we have in common. But I think what we're trying to do in terms of our cultural diplomacy, for want of a better word, and the embassies joining the DOTS programme, which is what we call this series of events and projects to sort of strengthen the relationship between the UK and Ireland outside the Dublin-London relationship. All of that is about, I think, helping people to understand each other better, even in a relationship which wasn't as fraught as the British-Irish one sometimes is. When I was in Sweden, for example, I saw it as part of the embassy's job to sort of correct some of the myths that maybe had grown up about Britain in another country. So in the Swedish case, you sometimes had the perception that Britain was all about the City of London and high finance, that there was no manufacturing industry anymore. And so we would do things to show that we had fantastic high-tech manufacturing and science. And I think that's also part of what we want to do here. We want to show the diversity of modern Britain, in all its successes and some of its flaws, to an Irish audience. Now, Ireland knows Britain probably better than any other country in the world as of shared media space, shared sporting space. But still, in a way, because of that closeness, there is sometimes perhaps the idea that, Ireland and people in Ireland know everything there is to know about Britain. And I think part of the challenge for us is to sort of explore undiscovered or less discovered Britain and promote that, including in the cultural field, to Irish audiences.
Well, I do find it interesting that it's places like Coventry and Leeds and Bradford that you're talking about here. I mean, one of the things, obviously, that's happened politically in Britain over the last 2 decades or so is the establishment of the devolved administrations. And it seems to me there are clearer relationships, or have developed over that period with, you'll see a lot of Irish people at the Edinburgh Festival and other festivals. You see connections between TG Cahir and S4C. Obviously, there's all sorts of north-south relationships on the island of Ireland. There's the two capitals, but there is this huge part of England in particular, it seems to me, that is deeply infused with the culture of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Irish migrants who arrived there over the course of a century and a half or so now. And it's everybody from John Lennon to the Gallagher brothers to all kinds of things. And that does seem a part of the relationship that has been underexplored.
It does, and I think both governments and both countries are waking up to that. So, for example, only last year, Ireland has established a consulate general, i.e. as a mini embassy in Manchester to represent Ireland in the northwest of England, looking particularly at the Manchester and Liverpool metropolitan areas for the reasons you give, that Irish people have gone there in their millions over the years, go there in their thousands every time Manchester United or Manchester City or Liverpool or Everton play at home. And there is a strong sense of interest in those areas with the relationship with Ireland. So at the end of this month, Andy Burnham, who's the Mayor of Greater Manchester, and his counterpart from Liverpool are leading what's not just a sort of trade mission, but it's a sort of relationship mission from those two cities, from those two great birthplaces of the Industrial Revolution. They're coming here, not just to talk sort of trade and investment with Irish counterparts, but culture and sport as well. So they're bringing a Manchester United and Liverpool Legends team, I think, to play here in Dublin. And they're going to celebrate the entire richness of the relationship between those two great sort of centres of Irish, immigration with the home country, but also a broader relationship between the northwest of England and Ireland.
So you're a Scotsman, so you bring a particular perspective to this relationship and these sort of cultural questions of cultural links. Would that be fair to say? I
think it would be fair to say, and being Scottish has been, of course, part of my identity, both growing up and ever since. So, for example, on Saturday, I'm going to the Dunleary Yacht Club for a rather belated Burn Supper, which is one of the ways the Scottish community expresses itself around the world. As a student, I worked as a guide at the ancestral home of Sir Walter Scott, one of the great Scottish romantic novelists. But my childhood was always heavily infused by music and theatre. My mother was very involved in amateur operatics and amateur dramatics, and every August we would go to the Edinburgh Festival and the Edinburgh Fringe and sort of overdose on plays and comedy and music. So that's been a big part of my life, sort of growing up. The Proclaimers are one of my favourite bands, and it's an important part of the sound of bagpipes still moves me, even if they're not played very well, and they're difficult to play very well. But yeah, it's a big part of my identity, I would say.
I mean, the Edinburgh Festival and various other events were very much conceived in the post-war era as being a way of bringing British culture to the world, or bringing world culture to Britain. I suppose both at the same time. How has that changed, do you think, over the years? We heard a lot in the wake of the political changes of the last few years about creating a new idea of a global Britain. I'm not exactly sure what that means myself, but how does that tie in with what we're talking about here?
I think part of the idea of global Britain was that the contention maybe that during our membership of the European Union, we'd been very focused on that set of political relationships. Obviously, we'd had a crucial relationship with the United States throughout, and with the Commonwealth countries to an extent, but that there were other parts of the world where our economic links and our broader political and maybe cultural links had been less explored. And given that Britain is a global nation in terms of people from almost every part of the world would live in various parts of Britain, I think there was this sense that the relationship could work in two ways. Britain should be projecting itself more around the whole of the world and asserting its newfound status post-EU exit. But also in terms of our own diversity and integration, it was very important that people from around the world felt that their culture was also important to Britain, so hence multicultural festivals. And I think in that sense, things like the Edinburgh Festival, but many other sort of festivals in towns and countries around Britain, no longer just promote, if you like, a sort of a single indigenous version of our history. So the small market town in the Scottish borders, where I came from, the prevailing aspect of its sort of annual celebration was marking sort of rather bloody victories over English raiders in the 14th century.
Well, nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that, and it has its place. But also, I think in multicultural cities in particular, it's really important that the great religious and cultural festivals of other cultures are marked as well, so everyone feels that sense of belonging and identity.
Because both our countries have changed enormously over the last generation or thereabouts. And they're both much more multicultural, as you say, and they're both, I suppose, more open to the world in many ways too. And does that maybe change the relationship between the two countries as well?
I noticed a big change in that. I mean, I grew up in a small, relatively speaking, ethnically homogenous town in the southeast of Scotland. I then went to Glasgow, which was a much more diverse experience for university, and then moved to London, where we live in South London. You're as likely to hear French or Italian or Polish voices as you are to hear English voices. And I think that's a great joy of living in a big sort of urban space. And I found that living in Paris and New York, and certainly Brussels as well. And I think it does change a country, and it can change a country for the better. In all these things, I think you need to find a balance. So you need to sort of preserve your country's own traditional culture, but you need to be sort of open and receptive to the sort of the culture of newer communities. I think a healthy society is one that's outward facing and sort of open to new experiences, as well as being proud of its past, but also cognizant of the areas and the times of its past which are less happy ones.
These are areas sometimes of political dispute and discontent, aren't they?
And I saw that living in America for a few years, that sort of culture wars, which are not really about culture, but are about sort of society and values, can be very sort of divisive and very sort of unhappy, places to be. And to me, the great joy of New York was this sort of melting point in which you could see world-class culture at the Metropolitan Opera House or in the Frick collection. And yet you could go downtown to Wall Street and you could, or somewhere in the village, and you could see the most sort of extraordinary sort of explosions of culture, sometimes quite sort of unrehearsed and spontaneous. And that to me is the achievement of a great sort of metropolitan centre. But that balance is not often easy to strike, and I think we all have a role to play in showing openness to others' cultures and an acceptance of that.
You mentioned earlier on that you had some time to prepare for this job. I have no idea how these things work in the Foreign Office or in the service. But does that mean that you specifically went looking for this job? Is there something?
Yeah, I
Ireland?
absolutely went looking for this job. So I was in the fourth year of my stint in Brussels. I'd been 2 years in our NATO delegation, and then I was ambassador to the European Union for foreign and defence policy. And the Foreign Office organised itself such that it advertised a number of senior diplomatic jobs, senior ambassadorships, all at the same time. And of the 3 or 4 that was coming up in Europe, the one I was most interested in was Dublin. So you have to write a one-page bid, which I did actually with a few sort of artistic and cultural references in my bid, and I was shortlisted for interview and was interviewed for the job by the now head of the Foreign Service and a number of other people, and was fortunate enough to get it. And you know about a year in advance that you've got the job. So I had, coming back from Brussels at the start of 2020, all these plans to go to, say, to University of Liverpool, which has a great sort of Irish Studies Institute, and to learn Irish, perhaps to sort of work in a company, a British company with interests in Ireland, or an Irish, investor in the UK, and to do lots of reading and to do lots of thinking and to meet lots of Irish people. And then, of course, COVID came along, and I went off to work in the COVID crisis unit in the Foreign Office for a few months. So my preparation was rather compressed, to the extent that I had literally 10 days of Irish language training, which was very much in one ear and out the other, I'm sad to say. But I did manage to do, read a few history books and start thinking a little bit about what the job would mean in all its dimensions, but not as deeply and as immersively as I did when preparing for Paris or preparing for Stockholm, which is a regret, but it's a minor regret compared to the regrets that other people had about the year 2020.
Well, indeed. And I suspect working for the COVID crisis unit would have been extremely demanding at that point in 2020.
It was a difficult time, partly because we didn't really know what the nature of the crisis was. It was expanding almost exponentially. When I've done previous crisis work in the Foreign Office, it's been to do with a particular region, like Afghanistan, Pakistan, or the Balkans. Here it was a sort of global crisis which was expanding into almost every corner of the world. We didn't know how the disease was going to emerge. We didn't know when vaccines might be available. Yeah, it was a sort of difficult time and quite unlike any sort of work I'd ever done before, to be honest.
So you didn't get the chance to do the prep, I suppose, which you would have hoped to have done. But clearly you came to the job with an interest in the country and the subject. I don't know if had you spent much time here over the previous years?
I'd been here once with my wife. In fact, she would have been my fiancée at the time, to come for a friend's 40th birthday party. I had been once, in fact, coming to this house when I was International Security Director in the Foreign Office about, 12 years ago, when Julian King was the ambassador here, and he invited me, I think it was in the run-up to an Irish presidency of the European Union, to talk to them about European security, interestingly enough, given the current context. And I don't remember much about this beautiful house except the wood-panelled dining room, because he hosted a dinner for me. But I think it was a winter visit, and I arrived in the dark and left in the dark. But I don't remember seeing very much of Dublin either. So seeing the beautiful city, the Georgian architecture, the closeness to the countryside, the closeness to the sea, exploring some of the fantastic sort of country houses, the museums, the galleries, all of that has been obviously much less of a feature than I'd have wanted because of COVID and the restrictions. But it's something that my wife and I are really loving getting ourselves acquainted with now.
Because I would have thought that part of your job is a certain kind of professional conviviality, which is making connections with people and being in the room with people and attending events. And so much of that was shut down for so long.
It was one of the, it sounds a bit sort of self-pitying to say it was one of the hardest things of starting here. But, when I started as ambassador in Stockholm, I had a diary that was already full of engagements. So receptions or dinners that we were hosting or going to. And so within 2 or 3 months, you'd met most of the government, most of the political leaders, top business people, top journalists like yourself, etc. And it was almost like a process of you were thrown into a swimming pool and you just swam, and at the other end you'd sort of done your length, as it were. Here, most of my contacts in my first year or so here were sort of Microsoft Teams meetings, Zoom calls. And
we all know how terrible they are.
Yeah, and I think my record was doing, 13 or 14 in one day. And when you actually meet people, I find that energizing. When you just meet them virtually and you have to sort of plunge straight into your discussion of whatever it happens to be without the chance to sort of have a bit of a chat about themselves, their family, sport, what they did at the weekend. You establish a relationship. It's really hard it's almost like you're starting to perform when you've not had your dress rehearsal or you've not warmed up your larynx, as it were. So I found that a sort of challenging aspect of starting this job during the COVID tunnel, as it were. But God willing, we've emerged from the tunnel, and one can now do normal diplomacy, which is fundamentally like journalism, like lots of other things. It's a contact sport.
It's impossible to do remotely, I think.
It's much harder to do remotely. You can do it to an extent, but you don't feel you're really getting under the skin of a country until you can sit with someone over a lunch or a dinner or a coffee or go for a walk with them and really try and talk and reflect and understand where they're coming from. If you're just having these rather sort of antiseptic 30-minute interactions through a small screen, you're not really getting the same impact, I think.
And so we're approaching the St. Patrick's Festival, which is very much a national celebration, as we all know. And I think a lot of people will recall in Ireland, it'll be exactly the 2-year mark since Leo Varadkar stood in front of cameras and essentially announced the country was shutting down. So there's a certain symmetry, I suppose, that 2 years on, we're having this celebration of opening up again.
Yeah, and for me, it will be a very particular sort of celebration in that on the 19th of March, 2 days after St. Patrick's Day, I'll be taking Princess Anne to the Ireland-Scotland rugby match at the Aviva, which is a whole other cultural thing in itself. I had the chance to go to the Ireland-Wales match at the start of the Six Nations, and just being with other people for one thing, but being in that fantastic stadium, hearing the national anthems, just the chance to sort of chat to people was a fantastic new cultural experience, really. So I've got that on the 19th, and then my wife and I are hoping to go to our first ever live Gaelic football match on the Sunday. So it's not sort of conventional culture. We'll no doubt fit in a sort of gallery visit or perhaps a concert around the festival weekend. But
I'm sorry it's going to go so badly for you, though.
Well, I am rather fearful, I must say. That first weekend, Ireland beating Wales by a country mile, but then Scotland beat England, and I was thinking, the Ireland-Scotland match at the end of the Six Nations might be the title decider. I fear it won't be for either of us, certainly not for us Scots. But having achieved our victory over the English in a way we could relax for the rest of the season, perhaps relaxing a little bit too much. I shouldn't say that because the head coach of the Scotland team, Gregor Townsend, was at school with me. He's a year younger than me. I knew my brother rather better. And another of my great sporting experiences was at the first, it would have been Five Nations then, match played at the Stade de France after the French Football World Cup. I think the following spring they used it for the rugby. And France were playing Scotland, and France, I think, scored 3 tries and were about 20 points up at the end of the first half, and I was almost tempted to sort of leave the stadium, but I had my mum and a friend with me, so we stayed on for the second half. And if my memory serves me right, and it may be playing tricks, I think Scotland scored 4 or 5 tries and we ended up winning the match. And that was just like an extraordinary... That would be up there with Elton John's 60th birthday concert at Madison Square Gardens, and hearing Simon and Garfunkel in Hyde Park is one of the great sort of moments of my life.
Right, well, let's hope that doesn't happen on the 19th, obviously.
I'm not too hopeful.
Maybe you could tell me a little bit more about your own cultural interest. You mentioned your mother's interest in dramatics, and what about you yourself?
So I sort of grew up surrounded by music in that sense, partly because she joined our local amateur operatic society at the age of 15 and was still on the stage, albeit very briefly, 2 years ago at the age of 85. So it's been part of her life literally for 70 years. And I too played a minor role. I was in productions of The King and I and Carousel as a sort of teenager, and played music in our church music group, and fell in love with the ballet while at university, and then moving to London as a young civil servant. Loved the West End theatre and the concerts. So music, I play the piano a little bit. Music and art has been a big part of my life, and it's also been something that, as I said earlier, in the various overseas jobs I've done, it's always been both a joy and also part of the sort of the professional learning to try and understand that nation's culture through its literature, through its music, through its art, through its theatre. So I've always regarded that as a sort of professional but also personal part of my travels.
And have you managed yet? I mean, it's really only a few weeks, I suppose, since, for example, theatres and the National Concert Hall and all of that have reopened. Have you managed to get to anything yet?
So we went to the National Concert Hall just before Christmas for a fantastic performance of 3 of the late Mozart symphonies, and hoping very much soon to go and see some theatre. Visited the Druid Theatre in Galway just a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, you spent a couple of days down in Galway, did you?
Yeah, I did, yeah. And it was a fantastic visit in the sense of being able to discuss the plans for the sort of development of the town, a big increase in population, and all the infrastructure that will go with that. I went to the National University of Ireland in Galway and also to the Galway Mayo Institute of Technology, about to become the Atlantic Technological University, looking at the fantastic cutting-edge science and research that was being done there. Went round the Druid Theatre. There wasn't a production on that day, but had the chance to sort of look behind the scenes. So yeah, it was a really fun and an interesting thing to do. So I've done Galway now a couple of times and Cork, and hoping to go to Limerick soon, and really looking forward to all the sort of festivals reopening, I guess, around the country after the last couple of years, and things like the summer schools, which are very good, political networking opportunities. So after sort of 18 months of enforced monastic seclusion, be a bit careful about the metaphor, but looking forward to getting out and about and enjoying myself.
And you mentioned the British Council, which is very much the instrument of all these sorts of connections. And I always wonder how much of those activities, is about bringing British culture to Ireland, and how much of it is about bringing Irish culture to Britain.
So it's a bit of both. And I know my friend Adrian O'Neill, the Irish ambassador in London, has created a sort of cultural councillor post within his embassy for, I think, the purpose of bringing Irish culture to the UK. I think the British Council's mission is different in different parts of the world. So probably if you're in, I don't know, Venezuela or Japan, it's probably not more of a challenge, but it's more of a requirement to promote British culture. In somewhere as close as Ireland, where people would be used to you popping across to London for the weekend and catching a West End show or something like that, then I think the task is more to sort of look at, as I said earlier, maybe undiscovered, less familiar forms of British culture, people who are innovating, whether it's in art or music and theatre, and bringing them over here, not really for sort of commercial promotion reasons, but maybe to form cultural partnerships. So to find a theatre company in Ireland which is perhaps doing something that's very complementary to what a British counterpart is doing, and seeing how they can feed off each other, learn from each other. So I think that's a fun part of the agenda. And as both societies evolve in different ways, particularly becoming, say, more diverse, more multicultural, what's the role that culture can play in that? What can we learn from each other in that area? I think it's an interesting agenda.
Because our cultural industries are so intertwined for really long-standing historical reasons. So, whether it's Druid putting on a show in the West End, or whether it's normal people being funded by the BBC, or whatever it might be, those relationships run very deep.
Yes, and I think one of the first formative theatrical experiences I remember going to see in the West End was Fiona Shaw in Deborah Parker's production of Hedda Gabler. And from the moment she came onto the stage, it was what I think Kenneth Tynan called a high-definition performance. You just sensed there was an electric sort of moment of theatre about to unfold. And I think you're right that sort of great art transcends national boundaries, and there's the boundaries between Britain and Ireland in the sense of being so close are such that you do get fantastic sort of cultural travel across the Isles. So a lot of that happens anyway spontaneously. So I see it as our job to sort of try and help those who otherwise would maybe struggle to promote their small theatre group or their music group.
So it's the more peripheral work that you see you have a direct role in
I think the big obvious things will sell themselves, sometimes literally. Not to say we shouldn't be involved with it, but I think it's maybe the things that are a bit more embryonic, or you would benefit from a bit more sort of promotion behind them that could benefit from
so
our
those would
help.
be the smaller festivals in Ireland.
In some cases,
some of the LGBT festivals, I think, saw the British Council were involved in, for example.
Yeah, and the embassy as well. So, and that's part of the agenda as well, about sort of showcasing our countries in all their diversity, and showing that the Britain of today is a lot different from the Britain of the 1950s. We'll be celebrating the Queen's Platinum Jubilee this year with enormous pride, and I think one of the things that we will show is how the country has evolved in the 70 years so far of her reign. And part of that is, I think, about social diversity, about multiculturality, about tolerance. And the same, of course, is true of Ireland, some of the big social changes and referendums and other things that you've been through in recent years. So I think there's a lot that each continues to have to learn from each other.
Do you think that message is particularly important at the moment? Because there may have been, and again, I'm not going to harp on about Brexit, but there may have been a perception of Britain turning away from the outside world in some quarters, certainly in Ireland, in the wake of Brexit.
Which I think is not a fair perception. And I think in many ways it's the reverse. We want to engage even more with the world more widely. So I think it's I think part of the whole aftermath of Brexit, and our foreign minister said this, was inevitably it occasioned a certain sort of introspection, that there was so much focus on the exact nature of the exit and the withdrawal agreement and all the sort of politics and complication that went around that, that to an extent we did sort of turn in on ourselves a little bit for a couple of years. And I've heard another of our ministers saying, part of the challenge for them as ministers was simply that for a long period they were obliged to sort of stay close to Westminster for all these knife-edge votes. Now we're in a different world and it is possible to get out and travel more. And I think in a way for the whole of the country it's possible to, and of course 2 years of COVID has meant no travelling has been possible. So we've had these two events or processes which have I think inevitably constrained us. Now we have this appalling situation in Ukraine and with Russia, and no one knows what's that going to mean for all of our security and the way we live over the coming years. But
do you think that may draw us together more than has been the case in recent years?
I was very struck at this British-Irish parliamentary event last weekend, that instead of a relentless focus on the details of the Northern Ireland Protocol or other aspects of politics in Northern Ireland or between the islands, there was this sense that such a horrific epochal thing was happening with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, that it was a reminder to Britain and Ireland and to Britain and the European Union that fundamentally the values, the interests we share in common as outward-facing liberal democracies are massively more important than some of the important but nevertheless relatively manageable, one would hope, differences that we have. And so I think this terrible crisis has, if it has one small upside, it's a reminder to all of us of the things that we have in common are more important than the things that occasionally appear to divide us.
Have you been surprised at all culturally by what you've encountered, albeit in these circumstances, over the last while when you thought about taking this job? Have you learned things that you didn't realise, or found a different angle on something that you didn't think was the way it was before?
I mean, one of my great regrets is that just not being able to sort of go out and about and see as much as I would have done. My wife and I were staying in Connemara for a few days at the end of January, and the hotel we were staying in had a small bar, and on the Saturday night there was this fantastic sort of impromptu musical performance. These two guys, both I'd have thought in their 60s, one with a squeeze box, one with a guitar, just sat and played Irish folk songs. And then there was only probably 8 or 10 of us in the bar. It was very socially distanced in front of an open fire. And it just seemed to me that after 16 months in Ireland, here was a sort of quintessential, Irish experience. So that was a real delight. I remember in New York going to jazz clubs. I remember once going to the Cabaret Bar in the Carlisle Hotel and sitting as near to him as I am to you. Woody Allen was playing with his jazz band, and that was an extraordinary experience. So I think those moments of you can experience an enormous piece of music in an enormous space. The St Matthew Passion in a huge concert hall, or yesterday at Christchurch Cathedral, a beautiful sort of Bach voluntary. And yet you can experience also culture close up and personal. I went to see Colin Murphy's fantastic play, The Treaty, in the round at the National Concert Hall, where the Doyle had originally sat after the war in Earlsford Terrace. And there was only about 30 of us in the audience and only about 5 or 6 people at any one time on the stage. But this fantastically intimate feeling of being in the rooms in Downing Street and in Hans Place, where the Irish and British negotiators were fighting out the terms of Irish independence. And I remember watching the play Stuff Happens, a similar play about the decision-making in the run-up to the Iraq War, and I think in a sort of school gym in Brooklyn, in New York, similarly in a sort of confined space, but that sense of great theatricality. And I think after these 2 desperate years of social distancing, it's actually quite nice to be, probably not very healthy in some cases, but quite nice to be in a relatively small space and experience culture in its sort of intense, intimate sense, as well as that big spatial sense. So that's a long way of saying very much looking forward to experiencing Ireland and all its brilliant culture in small spaces and in big spaces too.
Oh, may you enjoy many of those experiences in the weeks, months, and years to come. Paul, thanks very much indeed
Thank you
for
so much,
joining us. Thanks also to the St. Patrick's Festival and I.NY for hosting this conversation.